They said she was broken. They said she brought nothing but bad luck and a limp that would slow a man down. In the harsh winter of 1874, in a town built on greed and gunpowder, Elara Vance was the woman nobody wanted left standing alone on the auction block while the crowd laughed. But when Caleb Thorne, the most feared rancher in Montana, stepped out of the shadows and claimed her, he didn't do it for love. He did it because he needed a ghost. What he didn't know was that this unwanted woman held a secret that would save his life, destroy his enemies, and rewrite the history of the frontier. This is the story of how the reject became the queen of the Iron Ridge. The wind in Silver Creek, Montana didn't just blow, it bit. It chewed through wool coats and leather chaps, finding the bone and settling there like a permanent ache. It was late November 1874. The town, a haphazard collection of grey timber and mud, situated dangerously close to the treacherous Snake River, was buzzing with a nervous energy that usually preceded a hanging or a wedding. Today, it was a bit of both. Mayor Higgins had organized what he politely called a social introduction for the eligible bachelors of the territory. In reality, it was a cattle market, but the livestock wore calico dresses and desperate expressions. A wagon train of mail-order brides had arrived from St. Louis 3 days prior in fleeing poverty scandal or the ashes of the Civil War, looking for a new start in the unforgiving West. Elara Vance stood at the very end of the line on the boardwalk outside the general store. She kept her head down, her eyes fixed on the muddy tips of her worn boots. She knew what they saw. She wasn't a beauty like Sarah Jane, the blonde, currently giggling at the blacksmith. She wasn't sturdy and wide-hipped like Martha, who had already been claimed by a wheat farmer with 3 motherless sons. Elara was slight pale, and she leaned heavily on a hickory cane. A childhood fever had twisted her left leg, leaving her with a gait that lacked grace. In St. Louis, her stepmother had called her the burden. Here she was, just the runt. The air smelled of wet pine, chewing tobacco, and unwashed bodies. Sheriff Silas Boone, a man whose belly hung over his gun belt like a sack of grain, was acting as the master of ceremonies. "Next up we got Miss Clara. No, sorry, Miss Elara Vance," Silas bellowed, misreading the manifest. He gestured to her with a callous wave of his hand. "She reads, she writes, and she can sew a button. Who's interested?" The silence that followed was louder than the wind. A murmur went through the crowd of roughnecks, miners, and ranchers. "Can she plow?" one man shouted. "Can she carry a water barrel?" Another jeered. "She looks like a strong breeze would snap her in two." Laughter rippled through the gathered men. Elara felt the heat rise in her cheeks, but she didn't flinch. She had learned long ago that tears were a luxury she couldn't afford. She tightened her grip on her cane until her knuckles turned white. She prepared herself for the inevitable. The rejection, the pity, and the terrifying prospect of being sent back east, or worse, left to beg on the streets of a mining town. "Come on now, boys." Mayor Higgins tried to intervene, wiping sweat from his bald head despite the cold. "A woman's touch in the home is worth more than muscle in the field. Who'll make an offer?" "I'll give you a sack of potatoes for the cane." A drunk miner yelled from the back, sparking another round of cruel laughter. Elara closed her eyes. "Just let it end," she prayed. Let the ground open up. Then the wooden planks of the boardwalk creaked under a heavy, deliberate step. The laughter died instantly. It was as if the air had been sucked out of the street. A man had stepped out from the shadows of the livery stable. He was towering, broad-shouldered, and dressed in black duster that had seen more miles than most men lived. His hat was pulled low, shadowing a face that was a map of violence. A jagged white Ishoranlotor from his left temple down to his jaw, cutting through a beard the color of iron filings. It was Caleb Thorne, the owner of the Iron Ridge Ranch. They whispered he had killed a bear with a knife. They whispered he had buried 3 wives in the canyon. They whispered he had a heart made of the same granite as the mountains he lived in. Caleb didn't look at the crowd. He didn't look at the sheriff. His steel-grey eyes locked onto Elara. He didn't look at her leg. He looked at her hands, calloused still and strong despite her size. "I'll take her," Caleb said. His voice was a low rumble, like distant thunder. Sheriff Boone stammered, "Now, Caleb, hold on. You know the rules ain't exactly." "I said I'll take her." Caleb repeated, his hand resting casually on the Colt Navy revolver at his hip. "Unless someone else wants to bid." He turned his head slowly to survey the crowd. The drunk miner who had made the potato joke suddenly found his boots very interesting. No one breathed. No one dared cross Caleb Thorne. "She's yours, Mr. Thorne," the mayor squeaked. "Just sign the ledger." Caleb walked up the steps. He smelled of wood smoke, gunpowder, and cold rain. He stopped in front of Elara. Up close, he was terrifying. He was a wall of a man, radiating a chaotic, dangerous heat. "Get your things," he said. It wasn't a request. Elara looked up at him, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. I only have a satchel, sir." "Then you're ready." He turned and began to walk away, expecting her to follow. "Wait," Elara whispered. Caleb stopped and half-turned. Why?" she asked, her voice trembling but audible. "Why me, you heard them. I'm a cripple. I can't work your fields." Caleb looked at her, his expression unreadable. For a second, Elara thought she saw a flicker of something behind his eyes. Pain, recognition. But it was gone as fast as it came. "I don't need a plow horse, Miss Vance," he said coldly. "And I don't need a wife to warm my bed. I need someone to keep the ghosts away." "Can you do that?" Elara didn't know what he meant, but she nodded. She had been living with ghosts her whole life. "Good," Caleb grunted. "Wagons this way. Don't fall behind." As Elara limped after him, clutching her cane and her small, battered satchel, she felt the eyes of the entire town boring into her back. They weren't laughing anymore. Now they looked at her with something far worse than pity. They looked at her like she was already dead. The wagon ride was a torture of its own design. Caleb Thorne's wagon was built for hauling timber and carcasses, not people. It had no springs, or at least none that worked, and every rut in the frozen trail sent a jolt of pain shooting up Elara's bad leg. They had been traveling for 3 hours in near total silence. The town of Silver Creek had vanished behind the rolling foothills, replaced by the imposing, jagged silhouette of the Bitterroot Mountains. The sky had turned the color of a bruised plum, signaling a storm. Elara sat on the hard wooden bench, wrapped in a thin shawl that offered no defense against the mounting wind. She watched Caleb's back. He drove the team of 2 massive black draft horses with an effortless, almost careless competence. He didn't speak to the horses, and he certainly didn't speak to her. She studied him. The scar on his face was old, the skin shiny and tight. It looked like a saber slash, perhaps from the war, or a knife fight that went wrong. He wore his solitude like armor. "Are we far?" Elara finally asked. The silence was becoming heavier than the cold. Caleb didn't turn around. "Far enough." Is it just you at the ranch? Does it matter?" Elara stiffened. It matters if I'm to live there. A woman has a right to know if she's walking into a den of thieves or a home. Caleb pulled on the reins, slowing the horses slightly. He turned his head, giving her that piercing, sidelong glare. You aren't walking into a home, Elara. You're walking into the Iron Ridge. And you'd do well to remember that I bought your ticket out of that town. You ask too many questions. And you give too few answers, she shot back. The words tumbled out before she could stop them. In St. Louis, speaking back to a man like this would have earned her a slap. Caleb stared at her for a long moment. The corner of his mouth twitched almost a smile, but closer to a grimace. Maybe you aren't as meek as you look. Maybe looks are deceiving, Mr. Thorne. Maybe. He turned back to the road. Yeah. The horses picked up the pace. The trail began to narrow, winding up a steep incline, bordered by dense pine forests on one side and a sheer drop into a ravine on the other. The air grew thinner and colder. Snow began to fall, fat flakes that stuck to Elara's eyelashes. Suddenly the horses screamed. The wagon lurched violently to the left. Elara was thrown against the side railing, her cane skittering across the floorboards. "Hold on!" Caleb roared. He stood up, hauling back on the reins with all his strength. A massive shadow exploded from the tree line. It was a mountain lion, lean and starving, desperate enough to attack a team of horses. It latched onto the neck of the left horse, its claws digging deep into the flesh. The horse bucked in terror, dragging the wagon toward the edge of the cliff. The wheels skidded on the icy mud. Elara looked down. The drop was hundreds of feet into jagged rocks. Caleb didn't hesitate. He dropped the reins and drew his colt in one fluid motion, but the wagon jolted again, knocking him off balance. The gun flew from his hand, sliding across the floorboards and falling, stopping just inches from Elara's boot. The mountain lion was tearing at the horse. The wagon was tipping. Caleb grabbed the whip, lashing out at the cat, but the beast was frenzied. "The gun!" Caleb shouted, his eyes wide, with a panic Elara hadn't thought him capable of. "Girl, the gun." Elara looked at the revolver. It was heavy, cold steel. She had never fired a gun in her life. Her father had forbidden it. Women create life, he had said. They don't take it. But as the wagon wheel slipped over the edge, grinding against the gravel, Elara realized that sometimes you have to take life to keep it. She snatched the colt. It was heavier than she expected. She didn't think. She just reacted. She scrambled to her knees, ignoring the searing pain in her leg. "Shoot it," Caleb yelled, struggling to keep the terrified horses from dragging them both to their deaths. Elara leveled the heavy barrel, bracing it with both hands. The mountain lion turned its head toward her, hissing eyes glowing yellow blood dripping from its jaws. Breathe. Squeeze. Bang. The recoil nearly threw her backward. The shot was deafening in the canyon. The bullet struck the mountain lion in the shoulder. It wasn't a kill shot, but it was enough. The cat shrieked, released the horse, and scrambled back into the brush, leaving a trail of red on the white snow. Caleb immediately seized the reins, wrestling the horses back from the precipice. "Easy, easy now," he soothed them, his voice dropping an octave. It took 5 minutes to calm the animals. The wagon sat diagonally across the trail, one rear wheel hanging precariously over the void. Elara sat on the floor of the wagon, the smoking gun still in her hand. She was trembling so hard her teeth chattered. Caleb tied off the reins and jumped into the back. He kicked the wheel back onto solid ground with a grunt of exertion, then turned to her. He loomed over her, his chest heaving. He reached down. Elara flinched, thinking he was angry she had missed the kill shot. Instead, he gently pried the gun from her frozen fingers. He checked the chamber, holstered it, and then looked at her. Really looked at her. "You missed the heart," he said gruffly. I've never shot a gun before," she stammered, tears finally stinging her eyes. Caleb paused. He looked at the blood on the snow, then back at the small, shivering woman wrapped in a shawl. "You saved the horse," he said, "and you saved us." He reached out a hand. It was scarred and rough, but his grip was steady. "Can you stand?" "I think so." He pulled her up. For a moment, they were close. She could feel the heat radiating off him. She looked up into his grey eyes and saw that the wall was still there, but a small brick had been removed. "We have to bandage the mare," he said, stepping back. "Then we move. The wolves will smell that blood within the hour." "I can help," Elara said, adjusting her shawl. "I know herbs. I know how to stop bleeding." Caleb nodded once. "Then stop shivering and get down here." They worked in silence to patch the horse. Elara used strips of her petticoat and a salve Caleb had in his saddlebag. She worked with efficient, gentle hands. Caleb watched her, noting how she ignored her own limp to move around the horse. When they climbed back into the wagon, the dynamic had shifted. The air was still cold, but the silence wasn't as heavy. 2 hours later, they crested the final ridge. "Look," Caleb said, pointing with his whip. Below them, nestled in a valley that looked like a scar in the earth, sat the Iron Ridge Ranch. It was a fortress of dark logs and stone. There were no flowers, no curtains in the windows, no smoke from the chimney. It looked abandoned. It looked lonely. "That's it?" Elara asked softly. "That's it," Caleb replied. "That's where the ghosts live." He snapped the reins and the wagon descended into the valley darkness. Elara gripped the side of the seat. She had survived the auction. She had survived the mountain lion. But looking at that dark, brooding house, she wondered if the hardest test was just beginning. The front door of the main house didn't creak. It groaned, a heavy, timbered sound that echoed into the hollow belly of the structure. Caleb pushed it open and stepped aside, gesturing for Elara to enter. She crossed the threshold and immediately felt the temperature drop. It wasn't just the lack of a fire. It was a stillness so profound it felt like the air itself was holding its breath. The interior was vast-built of dark, hand-hewn logs that absorbed the moonlight filtering through the unwashed windows. Shadows stretched across the floorboards like long, skeletal fingers. Caleb didn't offer a tour. He walked past her, his spurs jingling with a lonely metallic rhythm, and lit a kerosene lamp on a side table. The yellow light flared, pushing back the darkness, but revealing a scene of stark neglect. It wasn't that the house was dirty. There were no piles of trash or rotting food, but it was covered in a layer of grey dust that looked undisturbed for years. It lay on the banisters, the heavy velvet drapes and the surface of a grand dining table that sat in the center of the room. "Kitchen's through there," Caleb said, pointing a gloved hand toward a dark archway. "Pantry has dry goods. Pump is outside the back door. The well water is cold but clean." Elara adjusted her grip on her cane. Her leg was throbbing with a dull, rhythmic ache from the climb and the adrenaline of the lion attack, but she refused to sit. "And where am I to sleep, Mr. Thorne?" Caleb paused. He looked at the staircase that wound its way up to the second floor, his expression tightening, as if the mere sight of the upper landing caused him physical pain. "Take the room behind the kitchen," he said, his voice rough. It was the maid's quarters. It's small, but the stove warms the wall. And you. I sleep in the study, he muttered, turning away to hang his gun belt on a peg. Or the barn, wherever sleep finds me. He looked at her, then really looked at her, his face half illuminated by the flickering lamp. The scar on his cheek seemed deeper in this light, a valley of white tissue against his weathered skin. Don't go upstairs, Elara. The floorboards are rot. It was a lie. Elara could see the wood was solid oak. He wasn't protecting her from falling. He was protecting the ghosts. I understand, she said softly. Good. I have to tend to the horses. Don't wait up. With that, he turned and walked out the front door, leaving her alone in the cavernous, silent house. Elara didn't move for a long time. The silence pressed in on her ears. She slowly walked toward the dining table. As she got closer, she saw something that made her breath hitch. The table was set. There were 3 places laid out. Fine china plates rimmed in gold, coated in dust. Crystal goblets that had turned opaque with grime. Silverware tarnished to black. In the center of the table sat a dried, brittle arrangement of what used to be wildflowers, now just brown skeletons in a vase. It looked as though a family had been about to sit down for dinner and then simply vanished. Elara reached out a trembling finger and touched the rim of a small plate. A child's plate. So the rumors were true, she thought. He didn't just lose a wife. A gust of wind rattled the window frames, making the house moan. Elara shivered. She picked up her satchel and limped toward the kitchen. She needed heat. She needed light. The kitchen was large and utilitarian, dominated by a massive cast-iron stove that looked like a sleeping beast. Elara set her bag down on a sturdy work table. She found the wood box, which was surprisingly full, likely filled by a ranch hand, not Caleb. It took her 20 minutes to coax a fire into the belly of the stove. As the wood caught and the iron began to tick and ping with the rising heat, Elara felt the tension in her shoulders loosen slightly. She found a kettle, filled it from the pitcher on the counter, and set it to boil. She wasn't a stranger to hard work. In her stepmother's house in St. Louis, she had been the scullery maid in all but name. She knew how to make a home out of nothing. But this felt like trespassing on a graveyard. As she waited for the water, she found a rag and began to wipe down the small table in the corner where she would eat. Under the grime, the wood was beautiful rich cherry, scarred by knife marks. Suddenly, the back door flew open. Elara gasped, spinning around her cane, clattering against the stove. It wasn't Caleb. A man stood in the doorway, stomping snow off his boots. He was older, perhaps 60, with a face like a dried apple and a white moustache that drooped past his chin. He wore a ragged sheepskin coat and carried a bucket of milk. He stopped dead when he saw Elara. His eyes went wide. "Well, I'll be damned," the old man wheezed. "He actually did it. I thought he was bluffing." Elara straightened her spine, smoothing her apron. "Good evening." The man stepped inside, closing the door against the wind. He set the milk bucket down on the table. "I'm Grady Miller. I run the herd when the boss is elsewhere. I'm Elara." Grady looked her up and down, his gaze lingering on the cane. He didn't scoff, but his expression was one of profound skepticism. "You're small," he observed bluntly. "And you're lame." "I have a bad leg, Mr. Miller. My ears and my hands work just fine." Elara replied, her voice steady. Grady chuckled a dry, rasping sound. "Feisty. You'll need that. This mountain eats the weak." He walked over to the cabinet and pulled out a tin cup. "Did he tell you about the rules?" "He told me not to go upstairs." Grady nodded solemnly. "That's rule number 1. Rule number 2 is, don't ask about the fire of 69. And rule number 3?" He leaned in, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Don't try to fix him. You can clean his house, cook his food, and mend his shirts. But don't try to mend the man. He's broken in places you can't reach." Elara looked at the fire dancing behind the grate of the stove. "Everyone breaks, Mr. Miller. It's how the pieces are put back together that matters." Grady drank his water in one gulp and wiped his mouth. "You seem like a nice girl, Elara. Do yourself a favor. Save your money. Catch the stagecoach back east come spring. There's nothing here but cold wind and memories." He turned to leave. "I left some salt pork in the pantry. Boss likes his coffee black enough to float a horseshoe. Good luck." When he was gone, Elara sat at the small table sipping hot water because she couldn't find the tea. She listened to the wind howling outside, battering the logs. Above her, on the second floor, she heard the heavy, restless footsteps of Caleb Thorne pacing back and forth. He was walking the length of the hallway, back and forth, back and forth. He wasn't sleeping in the study. He was upstairs, guarding the ghosts. Elara closed her eyes. She wasn't going back to St. Louis. She had been unwanted her whole life. For the first time, she was in a place that seemed just as broken and unwanted as she was. "I am not leaving," she whispered to the empty kitchen. "I am going to wake this house up." The sun rose over the bitter roots like a pale, cold eye. It brought light, but no warmth. Elara had been awake since 4. The cot in the maid's room was lumpy, and the draught from the window had chilled her to the bone, making her bad leg seize up with a cramp that nearly made her cry out. But she had forced herself up. She had massaged the muscle with her knuckles until she could stand, then dressed in her simple grey wool dress. By the time the first grey light hit the kitchen window, the room was transformed. The stove was roaring, radiating a fierce heat that chased the damp away. The smell of stale dust was gone, replaced by the rich, comforting aroma of coffee and frying bacon. Elara had found a sack of flour and a tin of lard. Her hands, usually trembling with fatigue, were steady as she worked the dough. She was making biscuits. Not the hardtack the miners ate, but fluffy golden buttermilk biscuits like her mother used to make before the fever took her. She heard the back door open. Caleb entered, bringing a gust of freezing air with him. He had clearly been up for hours. His duster was covered in fresh snow, and he smelled of horse sweat and hay. He stopped in the doorway, his body stiffening. For a moment he looked disoriented. The kitchen was warm. There was a checkered cloth which Elara had found in a drawer on the table. There was a plate set for him clean with a fork and knife properly aligned. "What is this?" Caleb growled. It wasn't a question. It was an accusation. Elara didn't turn from the stove. She flipped the bacon in the skillet. "It's called breakfast, Mr. Thorne." "I don't eat breakfast. I take coffee and jerky on the ride." "Well, today you're eating," she said, sliding the biscuits out of the oven. They were perfect golden brown tops, steaming in the cool air. She plated 3 of them, added the bacon, and turned to face him. "Sit." Caleb stared at the food. His jaw worked, the muscle feathering under his beard. He looked at the biscuits as if they were poisoned. "I didn't hire you to play house," he snapped, his voice rising. "I hired you to keep the place from falling down." "And a man who starves himself can't run a ranch," Elara countered, limping over to place the plate on the table. She gestured to the chair with her cane. "Sit down, Caleb. The cows won't die if you take 10 minutes." It was the first time she had used his first name without Mr. attached. Caleb looked at her, his grey eyes flashing with a sudden, dangerous temper. He strode across the room, his heavy boots slamming against the floor. He grabbed the plate. For a second, Elara thought he was going to throw it against the wall. She braced herself, clutching her cane. Instead, he slammed it back down on the table with enough force to crack the china. "You think you can come in here with your flour and your apron and fix things?" he hissed, leaning down so his face was inches from hers. "You think a hot meal changes anything? You don't know this place, Elara. You don't know what happened in this room." "Then tell me," Elara shouted back, her fear giving way to frustration. "Tell me so I stop walking through minefields. I can't see I am not your enemy, Caleb. I am the only person in this world who was willing to stand by your side when the whole town laughed at you. So eat the damn biscuits." Silence rang through the kitchen. The only sound was the crackle of the fire. Caleb stared at her. He seemed stunned that this small, crippled woman was shouting at the most feared man in the territory. Slowly the rage drained out of his face, replaced by a hollow exhaustion. He looked at the biscuits. The steam rose up, carrying the scent of butter and salt. He slumped into the chair. The wood creaked under his weight. He picked up a biscuit. His hand was large, scarred, and trembling slightly. He took a bite. Elara watched him holding her breath. He chewed slowly. He closed his eyes. When he opened them, they weren't angry anymore. They were wet. "Catherine made biscuits," he said, his voice a low rasp. "On Sundays." "Catherine," Elara repeated softly. That was her name. Caleb nodded. He took another bite, eating ravenously now, as if he hadn't realized how hungry he was. He ate the bacon, the biscuits, and drank the black coffee. When the plate was empty, he pushed it away. He didn't say thank you. He didn't smile. But he didn't leave immediately. "She died 3 years ago," Caleb said, staring at his empty hands on the table. "Winter just like this. Smallpox. It took her. And it took our son, William. He was 4. Elara felt a pang in her chest. "I saw the table. In the other room." "I couldn't clear it," Caleb whispered. "I walked out of the room to get the doctor. When I came back, they were gone. I never moved the plates." He looked up at Elara. "You're right. This house is a minefield, and I'm the one who buried the explosives." He stood up abruptly, the moment of vulnerability snapping shut like a trap. He put his hat back on, pulling the brim low. "Don't go into the dining room again," he ordered, his voice returning to its steel hardness. "Keep to the kitchen and the study. I'll send Grady to town for supplies tomorrow." He walked to the door, then paused with his hand on the latch. He didn't turn around. The biscuits were adequate. Then he was gone. Elara let out a long breath and sank into the chair he had just vacated. It was still warm. She looked at the cracked plate. He had eaten. He had spoken her name. He had shared his grief, if only for a second. It was a start. But Elara knew the battle wasn't won. As she began to wash the dishes, she noticed something through the window. Down by the barn, Grady was talking to another man. A man on a sleek bay horse who wasn't a ranch hand. He was dressed in a tailored suit that looked out of place in the mud, and he was pointing up at the house, specifically at Elara's window. Caleb walked out to meet them. Elara saw Caleb's posture change. He dropped his hand to his gun belt. The stranger laughed, a sound that carried on the wind, even through the glass. He tipped his hat to Caleb, then turned his horse and galloped away. Elara felt a cold prickle on the back of her neck. Caleb had his ghosts inside the house, but it seemed he had demons outside of it too. She dried her hands on her apron. She needed to find out who the man in the suit was, because if she was going to survive the Iron Ridge, she needed to know who was trying to tear it down. The snow had stopped, but the temperature had plummeted, turning the world into a sculpture of blue ice. 3 days had passed since the incident with the stranger. The tension in the house was no longer a silent thing. It was a vibrating wire pulled tight enough to snap. Caleb was barely sleeping. Elara would hear him leave hours before dawn, riding out to the perimeter fences, and he wouldn't return until long after dark. His eyes rimmed with red exhaustion. Elara had settled into a routine, but it was a lonely one. She scrubbed the floors until her knees bruised. She mended Caleb's shirts, stitching up tears caused by barbed wire and brush. And she cooked. She made stews thick with root vegetables, pies from dried apples found in the pantry, and bread that smelled of yeast and hope. Caleb ate the food, but he didn't speak. He was retreating again, building the wall brick by brick. On the 4th afternoon, Grady came into the kitchen. He looked older than usual, his face grey and drawn. He held his hat in his hands. "Miss Elara," he said, his voice quiet. "Boss says you're to pack your things." Elara froze her hand, hovering over the dough she was kneading. "Excuse me. He's sending you back to town. Tomorrow morning. I'm to drive you." Elara wiped her floury hands on her apron, her pulse quickening. "Why did I burn the roast? Did I speak out of turn?" "It ain't about you, Mom." Grady sighed, looking out the window toward the mountains. "It's about Silas Vane." The man in the suit, Elara realized. Silas Vane owns the bank in Silver Creek. He owns the copper mines to the north. And now he wants the Iron Ridge. He claims the boss owes back taxes from when Mrs. Thorne was sick. The medical bills were high. Vane bought the debt. Grady turned to look at her. Vane gave the boss an ultimatum 3 days ago. Sell the ranch by the 1st of the month or he burns us out. He's done it before. Accidents happen. Barns catch fire. Cattle stampede off cliffs. And Caleb thinks sending me away will fix this. He thinks sending you away will keep you alive, Grady said gravely. Vane's men are coming back. It's going to get ugly. This isn't a place for a woman anymore. Elara untied her apron. She moved with a speed that belied her limp. She grabbed her cane and marched toward the door. "Where are you going?" Grady called out. "To tell your boss that I am not a piece of furniture. He can just move when the room gets crowded." She found Caleb in the barn. He was sharpening an axe, the rhythmic shh, shh sound echoing off the wooden rafters. He didn't look up when she entered. "I told Grady to handle it," Caleb said, his voice flat. "I am not going," Elara stated, planting her cane in the straw. Caleb stopped sharpening. He looked at her, his eyes cold and hard. "You don't have a choice. You are my employee. I am firing you." "You can fire me," Elara said, stepping closer. "But you can't make me leave. I have nowhere to go, Caleb, and I am not going back to that auction block." "You'll die here," Caleb roared, throwing the axe down. It embedded itself deep into a chopping block with a violent thud. He stalked toward her, towering over her small frame. "Do you understand what kind of man Silas Vane is? He doesn't just want the land. He wants to break me. He'll burn this barn with the horses inside. He'll shoot anyone who stands in his way." "Then you need help," Elara said, unflinching. "I need a gunman," Caleb shouted, his frustration pouring out. "I need a partner who can ride and shoot and fight." Look at you, Elara. You can barely walk. What are you going to do against Vane's hired killers? Throw biscuits at them. The words hung in the air, cruel and sharp. Elara felt the sting of tears, but she bit the inside of her cheek until the pain grounded her. She looked at the man before her, terrified, cornered, and lashing out at the only thing he could control. "I can't shoot," she said softly, "and I can't ride. But I can read Caleb." Caleb blinked, confused by the shift. "What?" "I saw the papers on your desk in the study. The ones you keep staring at late at night. The demand letters." "You were snooping?" His eyes narrowed. "I was dusting, and I couldn't help but notice the seal. Vane and Associates. My father. Before he died, he was a clerk for a railway company in St. Louis. He taught me to read ledgers. He taught me how men like Vane hide their lies in the ink." She took a step closer, resting her hand on his arm. His muscles were rock-hard, tense. "You're trying to fight a war with bullets, Caleb, but Vane is fighting with paper. Let me look at the documents, please." Caleb looked down at her hand on his arm. He looked at the axe in the wood. He looked tired, so incredibly tired. "One night," he whispered roughly. "You have one night. If you don't find anything, you get on that wagon at dawn." Elara nodded. "Deal." The study was cold. The fire had died down to embers, but Elara didn't notice. She was surrounded by stacks of paper-yellowed deeds, crumpled banknotes, and aggressive legal threats stamped with red ink. It was 3 a.m. Caleb sat in a leather armchair in the corner, cleaning his Colt revolver. He hadn't spoken in hours, just watched her work. The rhythmic click-clack of the cylinder spinning was the only sound in the room. Elara rubbed her eyes. Her head was pounding. Vane's paperwork was a labyrinth of legal jargon designed to confuse and intimidate. He claimed ownership of the water rights based on a default of a loan Caleb had taken out 3 years ago to pay for a specialist doctor for his dying son. It looked airtight. Caleb owed $4,000. He had 400. "It's hopeless," Caleb said from the shadows, his voice heavy with defeat. "Go to sleep, Elara. Grady will have the wagon ready." "Quiet," Elara murmured, pulling a candle closer to a map of the territory Vane had included in the foreclosure notice. She traced a line on the map with her finger. Then she grabbed the original deed to the Iron Ridge Ranch, a document dating back 20 years. She compared the two. Her heart skipped a beat. She grabbed a magnifying glass Caleb kept on the desk. She looked at the signature on the loan modification document Vane had sent. "Caleb," she said. Her voice was trembling. "Come here." Caleb holstered the gun and walked over. "What is it?" "Look at the date on this loan transfer," she pointed. "November 12th, 1871. So that was the week William died. And where were you that week?" "I was in Denver," Caleb said, the pain evident in his voice. "Fetching the doctor." "Exactly," Elara said, her eyes wide. "You were in Denver? But this document, this transfer of the deed to Vane's holding company, it was signed here in Silver Creek, witnessed by the sheriff." Caleb frowned, leaning in. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying you didn't sign this, Caleb. It's a forgery. A good one, but a forgery. And look here." She pointed to the survey lines on Vane's map. "He's changed the boundary markers. He's trying to claim the creek isn't part of your land, so he can cut off your water supply legally before he even takes the ranch." Caleb stared at the paper, his hands clenched into fists on the desk. "He faked my signature. He waited until you were grieving," Elara said, anger rising in her chest. "He knew you wouldn't read the fine print. He knew you were broken." Caleb slowly stood up. The air in the room changed. The exhaustion was gone, replaced by a cold, terrifying clarity. "He stole my land," Caleb whispered. "He tried to steal my home while I was burying my son." "We can prove it," Elara said. "We take this to the circuit judge in Helena. Vane owns the sheriff here, but he doesn't own the territory judge." "Helena is a 4-day ride," Caleb said. "Then we leave now." Crash! The sound of shattering glass exploded from the front of the house. "They're here," Caleb hissed. He blew out the candle instantly, plunging the room into darkness. "Stay down," he ordered, pushing Elara under the heavy oak desk. Heavy boots crunched on the glass in the hallway. Smell of smoke drifted in kerosene. "Come out, Thorn!" a voice bellowed. It wasn't Vane. It was one of his henchmen. "Mr. Vane says time's up. Sign the papers or burn with the rats." Caleb moved to the door of the study, peering into the hallway. "Elara," he whispered. "Can you shoot?" "You know I can't," she whispered back, clutching the forged documents to her chest. "You hit a lion," he reminded her. He slid his backup pistol, a smaller derringer, across the floor to her. "2 shots, close range only." "What are you going to do?" "I'm going to draw their fire. You get out the window, run to the barn. Get Grady, get the horses." "No." Elara grabbed his duster. "There are too many of them." Caleb turned to her. In the darkness, he reached out and touched her face. His hand was rough, but his touch was incredibly gentle. "You found the truth, Elara. You saved the ranch. Now let me save you." He pulled away, kicked the study door open, and fired 2 shots into the hallway. "In here!" he roared, drawing the attackers toward him. Elara scrambled out from under the desk. She heard gunfire erupt in the hallway, deafening, chaotic flashes of light. She struggled to the window, forcing the sash up. The cold air rushed in. She threw her bad leg over the sill, falling into the snow outside. The pain blinded her for a second, but she scrambled up. The house was already burning. Flames were licking up the front porch. She saw shadows moving near the barn. Vane's men were torching the stables. The horses, she thought. If they burn the horses, we can't get to Helena. Elara didn't run away. She didn't hide. Clutching the papers in one hand and the small pistol in the other, she limped toward the burning barn. She wasn't the unwanted cripple anymore. She was the mistress of the Iron Ridge, and she was going to protect what was hers. The barn was a mouth of hell. Orange flames licked up the dry timber walls, feeding on the haylofts above. The air was thick with black smoke and the terrified screams of the trapped horses. Elara didn't stop. She threw her weight against the side door, stumbling into the inferno. The heat was a physical blow, searing her lungs with every breath. "Get back!" a voice shouted. A man, one of Vane's hired guns, stepped out from the shadows of the stalls. He held a torch in one hand and a revolver in the other. He grinned, his teeth yellow in the firelight. "Boss said no witnesses, girlie." He raised the gun. Elara didn't think. She didn't tremble. The time for fear was gone. She raised the small derringer Caleb had given her. She didn't aim for the man. At this distance with the smoke, she'd miss. She aimed for the torch in his hand. Crack! The shot went wide, hitting the wooden post next to him. The man laughed. "You missed!" "I wasn't aiming at you," Elara screamed. She fired the second and final bullet into the latch of the stallion's stall directly behind the man. The metal shattered. The black stallion, a beast of pure muscle and terror, kicked the door open. It swung outward with the force of a battering ram, slamming into the gunman's back. The man crumpled with a sickening crunch, the torch flying into the dirt. The stallion trampled over him, bolting for the open door, clearing a path. Elara dropped the empty gun and grabbed a pitchfork. She moved down the line, ignoring the sparks raining down on her hair. She threw open latch after latch. "Go, run!" She choked out, slapping the flanks of the panicked animals. One by one, the horses thundered past her into the snowy night. She was about to follow them when the roof groaned. A burning beam crashed down, blocking the main exit. She coughed, dropping to her knees, the smoke blinding her. "Elara!" A shape emerged from the wall of fire. It was Caleb. He was bleeding from a cut on his forehead, his duster smoking his face, a mask of soot and blood. He vaulted over the burning beam, landing beside her. He didn't ask if she was okay. He scooped her up into his arms as if she weighed nothing. "Hold on," he rasped. He kicked the back wall of the barn, a section of rotting wood he had been meaning to fix for years. It splintered. He kicked again, roaring with effort. The wood gave way. They tumbled out into the cold snow, rolling away from the structure just as the roof collapsed in a shower of sparks that lit up the valley like fireworks. They lay there for a moment, gasping for air, the cold snow melting against their burning skin. "The papers?" Caleb asked, his voice a wreck. Elara reached into her dress. She pulled out the envelope, singed at the edges, but intact. "I have them." Caleb looked at the papers, then at her. He started to laugh, a dry, hacking sound that turned into a sob. He pulled her close, burying his face in her smoky hair. "You crazy, stubborn woman." "We have to go," Elara whispered, pulling away. "They'll come back to check the bodies." Grady appeared from the darkness, leading 2 unsaddled horses he had managed to wrangle. "They're gone, boss," the old man said, racking his rifle. "Vane's men saw the roof come down. They think you're both Ash." "Let them think it," Caleb said, standing up and pulling Elara with him. He winced, clutching his side, but his eyes were burning with a new fire. "Help her up, Grady. We ride for Helena." Six months later. The spring of 1875 was the greenest the valley had ever seen. The wildflowers returned to the iron ridge, painting the slopes in violent shades of violet and yellow. The house was still scarred, the front porch blackened, but the structure stood strong. New timber framed the repairs, the smell of fresh sawdust replacing the scent of smoke. Elara stood on the porch, leaning on a new cane, this one carved from polished cherry wood with a silver handle. She watched the road. A buggy was coming up the drive. Caleb stepped out of the house. He wasn't wearing his duster. He wore a clean white shirt and a vest. The scar was still there, but the beard was trimmed, and the darkness that had shadowed his eyes for years had lifted. He stood beside her, his hand finding the small of her back. "Is that him?" Caleb asked. "That's the new sheriff," Elara said, smiling. Sheriff Boone retired rather suddenly after the judge saw those papers. That Silas Vane was currently awaiting trial in the territorial prison. The forged deed and the attempted murder charges had stuck thanks to the testimony of a certain crippled woman who stood before the court and spoke with a voice that silenced the room. Caleb looked out over his land. His herd had been returned. The water rights were secured. But he wasn't looking at the cows. He was looking at Elara. He turned to her, taking her hands in his. "Elara," he said softly, "you saved my life. You saved my home. But you haven't answered the question I asked you last night." Elara looked down, her cheeks flushing. "Caleb, people will talk. the unwanted bride, and the scarred beast. "Let them talk," Caleb said fiercely. "Let them talk about how the beast was tamed. Let them talk about how the unwanted woman was the only one worth a damn in the whole territory." He got down on one knee, slowly, stiffly, but deliberately. He pulled a simple gold band from his pocket. It had been his mother's. "I don't need a housekeeper, Elara. I don't need a ghost chaser. I need you. Be my wife. For real this time." Elara looked at the man who had bought her for the price of a train ticket, the man who had been a monster to everyone else but a savior to her. She looked at the ranch that had become her fortress. She dropped her cane. It clattered on the porch. She didn't need it to stand. Not right now. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, cowboy." Caleb stood and kissed her deep and long right there on the porch in the sunlight. And for the first time in years, the Iron Ridge wasn't a place of ghosts. It was a home. They say love is blind, but on the frontier, love had to see everything. The scars, the limps, and the broken pieces. Elara Vance wasn't the bride anyone wanted. She wasn't the beauty, and she wasn't the workhorse. But she possessed a strength that couldn't be bought at an auction. The courage to walk into a burning house for a man who had forgotten how to live. Caleb Thorne thought he was saving her from the world, but in the end, she saved him from himself. They proved that sometimes the things society throws away are the very things that hold the world together. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to hit that like button. It helps us bring more of these lost legends to life. And if you believe that everyone deserves a second chance, share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Make sure you subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss a tale from the Wild West. What do you think? Did Elara save Caleb, or did they save each other? Let me know in the comments below. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you on the next trail.